So today is the fourth session, as we were saying. With this Rethinking Security in Europe, we were trying to foster a debate that was seen from the peace sector or with a peace perspective, but open to necessary debates and dialogues that question nowadays if peace is not just enough and we're aiming for security, how can we have our own narratives, our own speeches and our own ideas from the not necessarily just military section, right? And sector. And this is why in the first session, we were asking what is security and what is security now in Europe, because it seems this last years, the term itself of the concept is evolving and shaping. The second and third session, we've been looking at who is providing security, what kind of security, and today we're going to have a new session. So let me just present you. Today we have a new rapporteur. As you know, we chose 5 last year or students or very young professionals who joined us. They moderate each session, and by the end they give us their closing remarks. So today we have Maria Roca, who studied global law and global studies at ESADE University in Barcelona. We also have Clément Menier and Cristina Barandi. Maria will introduce them, but let me just thank also to Paul Alberti, my colleague at ICIP, Chema, also our communications officer, and our interpreter for today, who's Adria Frank. That said, I'm going to yield the floor to Maria. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. So good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you for the organizers for this introduction and also for making this session possible. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the fourth session of this webinar series, Rethinking Security in Europe. So today's session, as Sonia has mentioned, it is focused on how is security provided, budget allocation, and instruments. We are very pleased to be joined today by Clément Menier, Global Policy and Partnerships Lead at the Minds Advisory Group, and Cristina Parandi, Policy Expert on European Peace and Security at PAX. Welcome both of you, and thank you very much for joining us here today. So I will briefly explain how this session is going to unfold. I'm going to pose an initial question, which will be addressed to both speakers, and then we will move on into a moderated discussion, which will be followed up with a Q&A session, where you will have the opportunity to pose any questions you have throughout the chat of Zoom. And then we'll conclude with the closing statements. So to begin the discussion, I would like to invite both speakers to reflect on the following question. How are security and defense policies currently designed in Europe? Clément, you have the floor.
Thanks, Maria, and thank you so much for having MAG a second time, although I understand that there were some technical issues last time. So I hope, I recognize that I'm not making up for it just by being able to connect this time, but hopefully I'll provide some useful insights. So thank you so much for organizing the discussion. So I will very much, to your question, I will very much answer from the Minds Advisory Group perspective. And I will use one specific case study, and I hope that this will not be too niche for the audience, but I think the current debate around anti-personnel landmines in Europe offers some really interesting perspective and some really interesting reflections on broader arms control, multilateralism, international norms, and the choices made around security for Europe. I will maybe just start by introducing who MAG is. So MAG is a humanitarian, non-governmental organization. We work in around 30 countries around the world, and most specifically countries affected by conflict, and most specifically countries affected by the presence of landmines, unexploded ordnance, and also countries where unsafe ammunition and weapons proliferation create risks for communities. So our perspective as an organization really comes from what we see after military and security decisions have been made and the long-term harm on societies caused by certain choices of weapons, and especially around the weapons of a certain kind that are indiscriminate. And I think the case of, again, anti-personnel landmines and European countries withdrawing from a major treaty offer a useful case study, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But first, to talk about this, I think we need to recognize the security environment in Europe and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has fundamentally changed European threat perceptions. And I think this is really, really key. And states bordering Russia have very real security concerns, and I think it's important to recognize that. But what we see is that European governments are seeking to respond to a lot of uncertainty around their own internal politics, international alliances, the future role of the US, and a broader sense of that the international order is becoming less predictable. And I think the big question is what kind of response these concerns produce. And at the moment, what we're seeing is that the dominant response is increasingly organized around military readiness, deterrence, defense, and rearmaments, as it was just mentioned in the introduction. So again, I mean, this is not entirely irrelevant. You know, of course, defense readiness does matter, but I think the risk is that the security policy becomes too narrowly defined around military gaps. And that approach can miss another set of very important questions. Again, as mentioned in the introduction, and I think the webinar series, was really well, thought because it's what kind of security are we producing, and for whom, and I'll get to my point is what are the long-term consequences of those choices made, including on arms control regime, diplomacy, and humanitarian norms. And I think this is where the anti-personal mines become an interesting case study. So just as a bit of background for the audience, earlier last year, 5 European states, so Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, and Poland, have officially withdrawn from the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention. And all 5 countries have referred the change of the security environment and the threat from Russia as a reason for leaving the treaty. And this is part of a wider pattern. Lithuania had already withdrew from another treaty, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, back in 2024. And this move of withdrawing from such a treaty is unprecedented in many ways. So I think these decisions really show how security policy is currently being designed under pressure. And a threat is identified, and a treaty commitment and a moral imperative is just judged to be a constraint. So the debates and the arguments we see are framed around deterrence and military flexibility, but the broader consequences are not always placed at the center of the issue. And that matters very much because anti-personnel landmines are not just another type not just another military tool. These weapons were banned 3 decades ago, and they were banned for very good reasons. These weapons, as you may know, are victim activated. And that means that they do not distinguish between a soldier and a civilian. They do not make the difference between wartime and peacetime, and between an advancing force and a family returning home. So once they are laid, they just wait. And still today, 85 to 90% of casualties are civilians, 90%. And today, the number of casualties are going up again. So the Mine Ban Treaty was created precisely because it has shown that these weapons cause unpredictable and long-term and indiscriminate harm. And it was a major achievement in 1987 when this treaty came about, because it was the first disarmament treaty that really placed humanitarian considerations at its core. It really helped establish the idea that some weapons create more insecurity than security. And again, this treaty is incredibly successful by many metrics, including the number of states that joined the treaty, 162, the percentage of reduction in the number of casualties, and the number of landmines destroyed. So when states leave such treaty, the significance is not only legal. Withdrawal sends a signal that under pressure, humanitarian restraint can be reversed, and it gives other states an argument. If European democracies can leave when they feel insecure, why should others remain bound when they face threats? And I'll come to the case of Lebanon maybe a bit later in the discussion. But I think, again, this is part of a wider pattern. Because Lithuania, as I said, withdrew from the Convention on Cluster Munition, and this year is very important because we're holding the third review conference of that convention, which will happen in Lao PDR. It will be a strong test for humanitarian disarmament norms. So I think the landmine debate reveals something quite important about how security policy is currently designed in Europe. It is increasingly shaped by urgency and perceived vulnerability. And it's not always shaped by a full assessment of the long-term human, economic, and legal and political costs, as well as all the reverberating effects on international norms more globally. So we as MAG, we see every day what the long-term costs that these weapons have on civilians and on communities and on societies. And I think the broader trends on budget says a lot about this as well. So I think this is the topic of today around instruments and budget allocations. And according to CIPRI, global military expenditures reached around $2.8 trillion in 2025, with military spending in Europe rising by 14%, so to more than $850 billion. And at the same time, official development assistance fell to $175 in 2025, which is a 23% decrease from 2024. And as MAG, we're seeing this drastic contraction from some of our key donors. And if and when there's no contraction by the donors, what we see is a narrowing number of countries receiving support for our work. Maybe we can touch upon different approaches to security later on, again, including the human security approach, or what some also refer to the 3D approach: diplomacy, defense, and development. But just to end, I think if Europe increases military capability while reducing international assistance, some states, and that some states even exiting some diplomatic space, like the Ottawa Convention, that it may be strengthening one pillar of security, but really much weakening other pillars of security. And I'll end there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Clement. Christina, over to you.
Sure, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm very happy to elaborate in the continuation of what Clement has already started, but building on these pillars of security and what exactly we mean. First and foremost, it's very important to recognize that security is a very broad issue, right? It encompasses...
Christina, sorry, there seems to be some problem with your connection. We're hearing you. It's like let's try again. Wait.
How is it? How is it now?
Much better and cleaner. Yes, thank you. Sorry.
Okay, maybe it's also that signal I need to speak a bit slower, but let's see. So it is very important to recognize, as this webinar series does, that security is a very broad concept because it encompasses a variety of issues, from really hard security in terms of weapons, defense, armament, to enabling environment for peace and security conditions. So this is really, really a broad subject. And PAX, as the largest peace organization in the Netherlands, we work with the subject both from the perspective of peace building and maintaining this societal background to have stable peace and security, to the question of how do we engage with the defense sector in the way of ensuring arms controls and safeguards and due diligence, so that even the so-called hard security angle is not really spiraling out of the international norms that we all want to defend. And to locate various elements of this broad definition of security, we also need to have a brief look about the European security architecture as it exists now. So obviously, I will not be aiming to be very comprehensive because you can write multiple books on the subject, but I think it's important to zoom out a bit and establish the basis what exactly we are talking about, and then to see how the evolution of various aspects of security have been shaping, leading us to the day which Clement mentioned right now, what we are seeing as the current trend. So security itself in Europe, of course, this is not something which is decided at one platform or at one forum. It is a very multi-layered structure, which consists of at least 4 different levels. First, of course, you have the level of member state. So this is where the key decisions are taken. This is where money is actually coming into. So member states level obviously is something fundamental. And when we talk about defense, when we talk about deterrence, those are the primary state-based approaches. And this is where member states play a really significant role. And the collective of member states obviously contributes to how we define security at the European level. Secondly, you have the EU level. And this is where we already see a lot of coordination, a lot of joint initiatives. So, of course, we can talk about the common security and defense policy. We can talk about common foreign and security policy. And this is a very big part of the EU's joint operations, stretching from cooperation with partners, foreign policies, geopolitical considerations, sanctions regimes, and all the way to defense industrial cooperation. So this is really, really, really a big stretch. But the added value, besides coordination for the EU, is also the ability to set the agenda. And what we have seen, for instance, with the examples, how EU has promoted the integrated approach to peace and security. If we look back, for instance, at the global strategy in 2016, what we also see is, for instance, the idea to cooperate more about, for instance, the climate security, to have the approach to dealing with fragility. So all of those agenda setting developments are happening at the EU level, and they shape in the way the perception of the national level. And this is really important to have this exchange, both bottom up and top down. Then we have obviously NATO level, and I will not go into details, but this is very important element because that first and foremost links the European angle of security to transatlantic one. But this is also where we see the reverse influence. So, for instance, if we're talking about the current 5% on 3.5% of defense spending commitments, we understand that it also comes from external factors, from the US requirements, from the transatlantic arrangement. So NATO is always there as one of the factors. And the fourth layer for the European security obviously relates to coalitions of the willing. So this is where you have cooperation between certain member states without formal EU processes, but it's more on the ad hoc basis or on strategic interest basis that they just decide to pull their forces together and implement certain initiatives together without having the consensus among everybody. And sometimes this is a really good development in the way of economizing resources and moving faster. But on other occasions, like we are seeing now, the discussions with nuclear weapons, that can also be very dangerous. That even if you have opposition in other member states, some would still proceed with some controversial initiatives. So to sum up this summary, it's important to see that all of these 4 layers, they do not operate in the vacuum. They operate in really close coordination among each other. So we see that those layers socialize among themselves, and they also affect each other thinking. They affect threat perception. They affect the idea of the security, whether it's broad, whether it's narrow. They affect the way how the ultimate decision makers are perceiving this issue. And obviously, we can also see how certain elements of security become more prominent or less prominent depending on the environment. And here, what we can clearly state is that there has been a certain evolution of how the thinking was evolving both at the European level, but also the individual levels. So obviously, after the Second World War, the main concern was the territorial security of European countries, of the Western Bloc as such, and that is very much focused internally. How do we make sure that we are prepared to face external threats and we withstand them? But then after the fall of the Soviet Union, these threats were not really coming from right outside of the EU. They were far away. And then the EU has been promoting very much the idea of being a soft power, being a normative power, and resolving conflicts elsewhere as the precautionary measure not to be affected by the spillover effect of this conflicts. And this is why we had so many peace-building initiatives. This is why we had a lot of, trade-related initiatives, development initiatives. And that was also part of the security thinking. So this is really important to emphasize, that security has not always been very hardcore. It was also, encompassing conflict prevention and dialogue and trade, and just making sure that we mitigate those crises even if they are happening far, far, far away. And then, of course, what we saw later was the development of the EU's so-called integrated approach. So if you have the crisis elsewhere, that you don't just come and resolve it by military means. You also try to work with the root causes of it, and you try to mitigate this. And basically what we saw more than 10 years ago with the global strategy, but also after the invasion, the first attack of Russia on Ukraine, that this approach that we can simply be relaxed about European internal security and just invest in other countries and destinations, it already started to change, because the security issue has become closer and closer home. So what we have been seeing since 2014 and since 2016's security strategy is the attempt to link this more normative, dialogue-based, diplomacy-based, conflict prevention-based approach with preparedness, but that was still very, very nascent. But the good result of this thinking was really the combination, how you can have this 360 degrees overview. And this is something which I would like to emphasize, because I will return to this a bit later. But then, of course, with the change of security environment in 2022, with the full-scale invasion, obviously now we have moved almost completely from this non-military aspects of security to more defense readiness, deterrence, militarized approaches, but also the industrial element. This has never been developed on such a scale before. So we are coming back to the point when Europe also says, hey, we still need to think about this internal Fortress Europe situation. And we need to think about both territorial security of Europe, of the EU, if you like. But at the same time, we need also to think what kind of global threats and transboundary threats we need to face. So this is exactly the balance where both of those threats are very relevant. But because the security challenge from Russia is so close and the reliability of the US is so questionable, the lion's share of attention, of resources, and of the political thinking goes exactly into this more hardcore militarized version. And what to do with that? Probably it's something which I can continue in the second round, not to overwhelm you and at once, but this is exactly where we come into the point where we are right now.
Thank you very much, Christina. So in relation to, both of you have said that because of Russia, we have shaped from a not so much military approach to a more military approach. And I would have a question of, are still the choices being made regarding security from actual challenges apart from Russia, or are some of these decisions just made on threats that politicians may easily communicate?
Yeah,
Christina, yeah.
Can I start? Yeah, is that okay? I think it's a really interesting question, and back to what Christina was mentioning around the territorial defense and the threat of threat or perceived threat, on territories is a really important point, because again, back to the landmine issue, and again, I know this is niche, but I think it does make the point on many of the aspects of this question. So, the decisions of those states to withdraw from the anti-personnel landmine treaty and to some extent consider restarting the production of landmines is not evidence-based, in the sense that 30 years ago, when the treaty came about, there was already a massive study conducted by the ICRC around the military utility considerations of landmines, and how the military utility, even if marginal, is completely outweighed and overshadowed by the humanitarian cost, the humanitarian impact of using those landmines. And I think today this decision was made not based on strong evidence, and I think it was really made, as you were just mentioning, based on, I think, a fear responding to maybe some political small gains to some extent, but not fully discussed. And I think this is where maybe those states that withdrawn and others that are considering need to have a fully informed debate around the issue, and they need to be presented with a full cost assessment of what landmines, actually cost in terms of managing them, producing them, but also, once the conflict is over, when wartime, ends, or when peace comes again, who's going to clear them? Who's going to manage those minefields that may move because of weather conditions, etc.? Who's going to pay for all the victims of the landmines, etc.? So there's a lot of considerations, I think, that we're not taking into account when those decisions are made or when the debate is happening in other countries. I think this is quite important. But also in terms of the full cost assessment, have those states consider the implications with regards to international norms, because withdrawing from such a treaty has inevitable implications on the international norms architecture, on the disarmament architecture, and on the international humanitarian law just generally. And I think this was not fully considered when the withdrawal happened. So yeah, I think this is my answer to your question.
Thank you, Clement. Christina, would you like to add some on what Clement stated?
Of course. So back to your question, what informs the decision? Is this real threat perception? Not. So at the core of it, threat perception is real. It's not even perception, like the threats are real, right? What we are seeing with Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and we just see that if you don't have military capabilities to withstand this aggression, that's a very bad place for Europe to be. So obviously, a lot of this push for strategic autonomy and a lot of the push for making Europe stronger in military terms, both for itself but also to help partners like Ukraine. This is absolutely okay. I see that it's difficult to hear. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. So obviously, the core of the concern is very real in the way of indeed there are capability gaps and there are objective requirements, what needs to be done to address them. And this needs to happen quite fast because we can't really wait. Ukraine, for instance, cannot wait for years before it will receive more air protection. But where it led us as well is also maybe a bit of simplification of understanding what else is needed. In a way of right now, we are seeing a lot of the discourse, we need to persuade everybody that 5% is absolutely necessary. But, this also opens the question if all the resources go into defense, and then if we leave other areas not covered, what will happen internally to the economic and social resilience within Europe? What will happen externally when we cannot maintain partnerships with other countries, for instance, in the global south, to implement a lot of those strategic decisions which are aimed to underpin security? And here I would like to also, because I started to talk about Ukraine, to use a few examples about how 5% only cannot bring us where we need to be, and you need more. You need, Clement mentioned 3D, I would say 4D. So it's defense, development, diplomacy, but also democracy, support for democracy worldwide. Is that, for instance, when in 2022, there was a UN resolution condemning Russian aggression in Ukraine and establishing the compensation mechanism for Ukraine. To make that resolution pass, you need a global consent. So you need already to have partnerships with other countries to support the initiative like this. And for those partnerships, you also need to invest in them. You also need to invest in diplomacy, development cooperation, and in maintaining this network. Same with the ammunition for Ukraine, like Czech Republic was implementing by procuring ammunition from states like Central Asian states to make sure that we can get those things that Europe is not producing. But to reach out to those states and to have those security arrangements in place, you don't do that with just military complex on your own. You really do it through some other means. So this is just to reiterate that indeed needs are real, but the way we address security, if we start to address it only by military means, we really risk undermining the very objectives we have, because we are depriving ourselves of the toolbox that the EU has, the variety of instruments in the integrated approach to peace and security. And then it actually can backlash in really worsening of security and peace conditions, both in Europe and externally.
Thank you, Cristina. So thank you both for your insights. And now, building on this discussion, I would like now to move into a more forward-looking perspective. How do you believe security policies should be designed in Europe? Cristina, you have the floor.
Okay, I'm getting the message that signal is not very well. So if you start hearing me, I'll try to reposition. If you hear
we
it,
can hear you properly now. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I would say, and this is also what we at PAXA are currently working on to address multiple layers of this debate. I would say there are three concrete things that European countries and the UN, I'm using these terms interchangeably right now, needs to take into account. And I would call this a T-shape approach. So it's like letter T. So on the horizontal level, you have the definition, what is security? So here exactly is avoiding the very narrow definition of security and reducing it to military and defense industrial complex, but indeed including those 4D elements. So defense, diplomacy, development, and democracy. So this is exactly making sure that the budget allocations are done not only to one of them, but to all of them, and are proportionate depending on the threat assessment and on what we need to do. Second element is actually coming back to the roots of the human security. So even if we are moving down in this vertical element of security, of the T shape, in making sure that human security is still integrated and mainstreamed in all decisions, also in the military decisions, also in the defense decisions. But this is really crucial to keep in mind as the fundamental approach to security in general. And the third element is, again, in the vertical part of the T, is to make sure that we maintain sufficient safeguards on the military decisions. And that includes upholding due diligence. That includes upholding human rights norms. That includes upholding international law. So there are enough of appropriate conventional military measures that countries can do without really recoursing to violations of international law or relaxing the due diligence requirements. And unfortunately, there is a risk of going in that direction. So this is really something that Europe, EU needs to uphold, because that's also part of its strengths, having rules, having procedures, and being really a peace actor who cares about international norms and international law. And maybe one more point to add, as the defense is growing, and it's also a bit connected to what Clement said about who's going to pay for the damage of certain weapons. I would argue that with the rise of military budgets, we also need to make sure that those budgets include the measures to address, to mitigate those negative consequences, whether it's for the environment, because when you store those weapons and ammunitions, you definitely have pollution, you definitely have a lot of problems, and you need to address that. And that needs to be part of your defense strategy as well, to, victims assistance, to cleaning up controversial weapons like mines, to making sure that people and societies are not really affected by those weapons that, are kept growing in the long-term run.
Thank you, Cristina. Clement, over to you.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I can't agree more with what Cristina has said, and again, I'll try and and talk from the perspective of MAG and from the arms control regime. But I think security policies should be designed around consequences and take into account a holistic approach of certain choices. States have a responsibility to protect their populations, but security policy can become quite ineffective if it's viewed too narrowly. And I think, Christina talked about the human security approach, which is, extremely relevant. And in our current environment, the fear is understandable, but fear should not lower our standards and our threshold and principles, including for the weapons that are used, and especially those that we know will create predictable harm to civilians. And I don't think it should be enough to say that, this weapon might have some military utility, because at the end of the day, almost any weapon can have some military utility in some type of scenario. And I think the real question is whether the expected military benefit justify the massive long-term humanitarian and development impact on population. And again, as I was mentioning just previously, this question was addressed back in the 90s when the treaty was negotiated and agreed. And I think, we're standing now 30 years later, and I think we're yet to see more evidence, especially given modern warfare system, and a good rationale for integrating landmines into a state's military doctrine. So I think the first point is really that the security policies should not be driven by fear, but should be driven by an evidence-based approach. And again, back to what I was just saying, I think it's important also that security policies present the full costs of choices made. And before governments consider investing taxpayers' money into restarting, for example, the production of landmines or rethinking their doctrine around anti-personnel landmines, I think they should really ask themselves, with their citizens and with parliamentarians, very concrete questions such as how much will it cost to our own societies to deal with those landmines in the future? Because the security decision is taken in one moment, but the insecurity is lived for years and even decades, and we see that every day with Mag in the field. Christina touched upon the human security angle, and I think this is very important. If a policy creates long-term harm and danger for civilians, for their livelihoods, for recovery, then we probably need to ask whether it is actually producing security. And maybe I'll just again, talk about norms. I think any security policy decision should take into account the global international norms and the architecture, and including international cooperation and assistance. And I think I will come back maybe to the case of Lebanon, which I was just mentioning at the beginning. International cooperation is recognized in the architecture of humanitarian disarmament and arms control. And it's one of the way treaties and instruments work, and affected states need to support others to comply with their obligations. And what we've seen just recently with Lebanon acceding to the mine ban treaty in an ongoing conflict, I think will be a test to international cooperation and assistance. And we hope that positive signals will be sent to Lebanon by supporting the country in the implementation of the treaty. And we can argue that international cooperation assistance can be treated as a security investment. But again, if security is seen as something more broader and comprehensive than defense and deterrence, I think investing in international cooperation and assistance can be, seen as security investments. Over.
Thank you, Clement. So thank you both for these contributions. And I would like to turn now to a more practical and immediate perspective. What do you see as the most urgent short-term needs in security and defense in Europe? Clement, you can keep going.
I think from my perspective, the urgent need is not simply more defense. It is responsible defense. Europe needs to make sure that it does not weaken, again, the very roles and the norms and institutions that have made European security meaningful over the past decades. So in terms of priorities, from my perspective and speaking from my experience with MAG, the first is that, again, states have responsibility to protect their population. So defense should not mean reopening the door to any kind of weapons that we know will create long-term harm. So in relation to that, again, key priority is to protect international humanitarian law, humanitarian disarmament norms from further erosion, because we've seen these trends in the past 2 years, and it's very, very worrying. And I think the third is that if Europe is procuring, and transferring more weapons and ammunition, then the control and the safe and accountable management of those weapons must increase too. And I think this is where other treaties are interesting treaties and instruments, such as the Arms Trade Treaty, the UN Programme of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons. I mean, all of these are extremely relevant to the current situation. And on that note, I will travel to New York next week as part of MAG's delegation to take part in the biannual meeting of states of the UN Programme of Action on Small Arms. And if Europe is serious about responsible defense, it must also invest in safe and accountable weapons management, including stockpile management, tracing, marking, and preventing diversion. And for that, Europe needs to be invested in international cooperation. I mean, and again, I mean, this is to ensure that the transfers that are operated by Europe today do not become illicit proliferation problems for tomorrow. And maybe a last point, which is, I think, another urgent priority for Europe that I haven't touched upon yet, but that is extremely important considering the recent conflict in the Middle East and in other places, which is the civilian protection when explosive weapons are used in populated area. And I think, you know, Gaza is one of the clearest contemporary examples of the humanitarian consequences of using explosive weapons in densely populated areas, massive civilian harm, destruction of homes and essential infrastructure, and long-term exploded ordnance contamination in this situation, and huge obstacles to humanitarian access and return construction. And this matters for European security policy because Europe has endorsed this political declaration called EWIPA and presents itself as a defender of international humanitarian law. And so, you know, Europe's investment in those kind of political spaces is really, really critical. So, yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Clement. Cristina? And sorry, if you could please, Cristina, keep it to 3 minutes more or less intervention because we're running a bit out of time, so we have time for the Q&A.
Sure.
Thank you.
Of course. So in terms of urgent steps, I think right now, especially the next few months, are really important because of the many decisions that are being shaping at the European level. So here we expect a new European security strategy to come out quite soon. There is, of course, NATO summit coming up in July, and negotiations over the next EU long-term budget are ongoing. So, of course, those are exactly the points when the right decisions need to be put in operationalization and into policies. And the content of those decisions, well, I mean, as I mentioned, there are really critical priorities like providing support to Ukraine and making sure that Europe is stronger. But at the same time, those decisions need to take into account the aspect how you can do more with less in the way of more European level coordination, that you don't really just go and follow this 5% or 3.5%, just like this percentage-based approach, but you really think how you can make the Pareto principle, how you can achieve the most in the right way through more cooperation so that you also have money and political space for other priorities, and to reflect that on the level of the strategy and on the level of concrete plans. I think those are really the most important political priorities right now in this field.
Thank you, Cristina. So now we have finished this question on speakers, and we will follow on through with the Q&A session. And for this, I yield the floor to Paul. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria, and thank you so much for all your questions from the audience. Let's start with Jordi Costa's question, which is in Catalan. He asks whether there is a tracking for the anti-personnel mines fabrication and stock and all and everything related to mines, if there is a tracking within the military in Europe. And also he asked for the influence in AI in this tracking. I suppose this is to Clément.
To the landmine guy. Thanks, Paul. Maybe just to clarify the question to make sure I get it right, is it tracking of production or tracking of use globally?
I think he refers to tracking of production and stock.
Yeah, stockpiles.
Stockpiles.
Okay. Well, for the European Union, there's a consensus. There was a consensus around the treaty, and one of the pillars of the treaty is to eliminate the use of landmines, but also the stockpiles of landmines. So since the treaty was signed in 1987, there was more than 55 million landmines destroyed. So all European states have destroyed their stockpiles. To my knowledge, there's no tracking of that for European states, but there's no production in Europe of landmines, although there are some considerations in Poland to restart the production, and there are some articles around that. But I think a useful document and a useful publication that comes every year is called the Landmine Monitor. And this is done by the International Campaigns to Ban Landmine, to which MAG is a founding member. And it really covers the full picture of landmine production, use, casualties, etc. worldwide. And I think the second point was around AI. The use of AI, is it the use of AI to track production or the use of AI to detect landmines?
It is not specified in the question. Is just about the usage of AI. Okay.
Well, I can answer quickly on the first point. I think in terms of using AI to track the production, obviously, if there's some publications out there, the AI can, the artificial intelligence can probably, detect references to that. But I think an interesting point is around AI, using AI to detect landmines for clearance purposes. And this is something that obviously MAG as an organization is very much looking into, as we're looking into new technology generally to try and accelerate and improve effectiveness of removing landmines. There's a lot of considerations. There's a lot of progress, especially using drones and imagery to try and detect, those signals or those evidence on the ground that look like landmines. So to try and detect them from above. Obviously, this is, there's a lot of progress, but we are yet to use only AI to detect landmines. This is not going to happen in this year or next. The human element is very, very critical. We still, use a lot of human resources and people to do this work on the ground. So yeah, it's nascent, let's say.
Right. And next question from Jordi Costa as well. He asks if there is a place, if there is room for a non-armed defense, and what would that look like based on non-violence and a different kind of politics of security. So this is something also for the next session. So, but if you want to give a few ideas on that, Justina or Clément.
Yes, I will elaborate on this. So very much depends on the context, right? Like if you are enduring the ongoing attack, obviously you need to defend yourself. That's clear, and there is no way that you can just see how your cities are being destroyed and your territories are being occupied. So obviously not in these situations, but of course, if we talk about defense and preparedness and whole of society resilience, of course, this is very much about also social cohesion. So if you are not under direct attack, but you want to be more resilient as the society, more protected from hybrid warfare, from different types of threats, of course, this is non-military in the way how you build connections in the society, in the way how your institutions
function, how you receive appropriate, services from your institutions, how you also trust your government, and how you are just ready to meet those risks. So in those ways, it's really important to pay attention to these aspects and invest in those aspects also at the European level. And of course, even during the active armed conflicts, there are also a lot of means of non-violent support. For instance, in the situation of occupation, when you cannot really respond with arms, but that you can also do a lot to preserve the spirit and just endure and change the situation. And we have been seeing that in Ukraine as well, in the occupied areas, with non-violent movements who have helped a lot to deal with the Russian aggression in general.
Thank you so much, Christina. Clément, would you like to add something on that?
I mean, not much. Maybe, I think, again, investing in social cohesion, as Christina was mentioning, but also investing, in conflict prevention. I think globally, is always a good investment and a good return on investment. And again, I think, international cooperation as a whole offers quite an interesting platform and tool for dialogue and to build trust among states, and also sometimes to build trust between citizens and their states. So a lot of different routes to explore.
Thank you so much. And for one final question from Julia Marco, who unfortunately had to leave, but is desiring to watch the webinar afterwards on the recorded version. She asks, from the standpoint of a civil society representative, who practically shapes security priorities in Europe today? Is it elected governments, NATO structures, defense industries, intelligence communities, or public opinion? And better put, which actor currently has disproportionate influence in this matter? She also adds that we as a civil society organizations, how we have to shape our activities and our narratives to make politicians take faster and better decisions.
I can start with that question. So as I mentioned also in my intervention before, obviously national governments are the key players, but they are affected by a variety of influences, right? So and in democratic societies, those influences are broad. In more closed societies, those influences are more closed. So what we need to avoid at all costs is that industrial logic leads discussions on security. When you have big arm production companies just lobbying for the use of weapons when you could have prevented the conflict in the first place. So and that is something also maybe connected to the second part of Julia's question, is that as civil society in Europe, we still have enough platforms to voice our concerns or to voice our recommendations and to affect the level of decision making. So as an example, so we are members of APLO, and APLO is, and of course, all the organizations participated today are members of this coalition of organizations who work with the EU level stakeholders to promote the vision of security that we believe is important, to move beyond just military approach. This is one of the good examples. But for organizations also at the local levels, at each individual country, it is really important to keep invested in creating the space, to safeguard the civic space, to make sure that we fight for the rights of democracy and being heard and human rights, and that we can have those dialogues within the society to affect decision making on the higher level.
And I can answer from Mac's perspective, trying to complement what Christina has been saying. I think, as Christina was mentioning, I think civil society still has quite a space, an open space in Europe, to influence security policies, but again, I think an interesting example, for example, is, this year we will have the review conference of the Convention on Cluster Munition. Lithuania withdrew from that convention last year officially. And, this is an opportunity, I think, for civil society, different type of movement and organizations to show up for this review conference with evidences of how, cluster munitions how much close emission have impacted societies where it has been used, to make sure that the norms remain. So this review conference, for example, will be a strong test, and civil society has a strong role to play in that. And leading up to the review conference, there are a lot of different opportunities for civil society organizations like MAG, but also citizens, to engage with states, with their parliamentarians, to make sure that the states that will go to this review conference, play their parts and make sure that the norm doesn't erode further. Thank you.
Right, thank you to both of you. And with that, I return the floor to Maria Roca, so she can give the final remarks of the whole webinar, and then we can conclude the session. Maria, whenever you want.
Thank you, Paul. If we take a step back, today's discussion shows a very clear evolution in how security policy in Europe is understood. As Christina explained, traditionally, European security was broader and less militarized, based on diplomacy, cooperation, and peace building, with the EU playing a strong soft power role. This has clearly changed. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, both speakers highlighted how threat perceptions have shifted dramatically. Security has become more immediate, more local, and as a result, policy responses have become more focused on deterrence and military capability. Clement illustrated this shift with the example of several European states withdrawing from the Mine Ban Convention. As he pointed out, these decisions show how security policies are increasingly taken under pressure, prioritizing military flexibility, sometimes at the expense of humanitarian considerations. This leads to one key concern raised during the discussion: the risk of narrowing security policy too much. Clement stressed that the question is not only how to strengthen defense, but what kind of security we are producing and for whom. He warned that certain military choices, such as landmines, have long-term impacts, mainly on civilians, and that these consequences are often not fully assessed. At the same time, both speakers have noted that we are seeing a major increase in defense spending, while other areas like international cooperation or assistance are being reduced, effectively strengthening one pillar of security while weakening others. Christina complemented this by explaining how the different layers of European security interact and how the current context is making the military dimension much more prominent. However, she also reminded us that the security should remain a balanced system, not a purely militarized one. Looking ahead, both speakers were very clear on how security policies should be designed. It is emphasized that the need for a more holistic and evidence-based approach, and decisions should not be driven by fear, but by a full assessment of their consequences, including humanitarian and long-term impacts, and should remain anchored in international norms. Additionally, security requires an integrated approach combining defense and diplomacy, development and democracy, and legal safeguards. Budget allocation should reflect this balance, not undermine it. Finally, on short-term priorities, an important nuance emerged. As seen in today's session, the issue is not simply increasing defense, but ensuring responsible defense, including stronger control over weapons, avoiding choices that could weaken humanitarian law, and having an overshadowing of cost over what the benefits have the weapons given us. It ought to be underlined that the coming months will be critical and that the focus should not be just on spending more, but on using resources more effectively and cooperatively. So, to conclude, Europe is facing real security threats, but as both Clement and Christina highlighted, the key challenge is not only how much Europeans invest in security, but how it defines it. Because ultimately, security that is too narrow, too reactive, or too detached from its long-term consequences risks undermining the very stability it aims to protect. So, there might be a question arising from this session, which is there an alternative to military security? And that is what in the next and last session of this webinar will answer, and that is creating security beyond the military. What else? Thank you again to the speakers, to the organizers, and to all participants that have connected.
Thank you, Maria. I don't know Kim and Christina, but I'm not to sound maternalistic, but I'm finding some comfort in ending all these sessions, listening to students or young professionals that are yet passionate and well prepared. So we know there will be some kind of lead and people who will take on the lead once we get older and older. Thank you so much. Paul and I wanted to highlight that both PAC and MAC have been very committed to this cycle, and it has been very easy to work with them, but they have been very helpful. And thank you for really not just checking the box, but like really contributing and making it easier. Maria, thank you very much for your rapporteur task today. And thank you to our interpreter, Adrià, who has been translating into Catalan, and to everyone who joined. We were about 30 people at some moments, but remember, all the sessions are there online. So from Paul, Chema, and I at ICIP, moltes gràcies, thank you very much, and see you on June the 3rd for our last session. Clément Meunier and Cristina Parandi were our speakers today. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so
much
much.
to the Institute. Well done. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much to both of
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Merci.
Gràcies a tothom.
Merci.
Adéu, bona tarda.